Welcome, everyone. I'm Rob Kidd, the Vermont Chapter of the Sierra Club Conservation Program Manager. For those who have not been involved with the Sierra Club, our priority issue area that we've been working on is transportation, and particularly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to start this conversation with Christopher Parker of the Rail Action Network to talk about rail priorities. And that's one of the areas that we haven't worked a lot on, but there's so many different areas that we can be involved with to actually drive that conversation forward. So welcome, Christopher. But anybody along the way, if you have questions, type it in the chat. And afterwards, Christopher's done speaking, our normal MC, Stephen Crowley, who just joined on, will be taking on and moderating the question and answer. So feel free to type in the chat and we'll go with that. So welcome, Christopher.
To be here with all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about rail and the environment, but I'm here because we, the Vermont Rail Action Network, have been working together with Rob and the Sierra Club on the Transportation for Vermont Coalition, and I really value that connection. So thank you, Rob, for the work you've been doing on transportation in general. It's important. So I'm here because I grew up next to a railroad line and I liked the trains, and I grew up next to the Potomac River and I liked the environment. And both of those became a part of who I am. And, I have a commitment both to railroads and to the environment. So here I am. Of course, by this time, it's fair to say that the climate catastrophe that's bearing down on us from global warming is the defining apocalyptic moment of our time. It's the crisis we have to solve. So that's easy to say, but what I typically hear is not necessarily solutions. I hear targets like 350, right? And I hear aspirations of improvement, which is all good. But I think what we're really doing is going through the stages of denial, of anger and denial and so forth. But that's good news because it means we're going to get to that point of solutions. So that's what I'm looking towards, is solutions. And I'm here because rail should be part of that solution. We have something particular to offer that without, the solutions will be incomplete. So, of course, that transportation is the largest contributor to global warming. And in Vermont, it's about 50% in a big round number of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're serious about global warming, we have to be serious about transportation emissions. The good news is things are starting to shift. And that's good, but electrifying vehicles can't be the whole story. So personal travel, that is automobiles, is only 58% of transportation emissions from global warming. So we need to address the 42% that is outside of the automobile, as well as, of course, take down the number of individual internal combustion fueled car trips. You may also know that converting to EVs, electric vehicles, is only going to amount to a 20% reduction in emissions. So again, that means that we have to look beyond simply electrifying the fleet. That's a good goal, but I'm here to add to that package. And before I go on and talk about rail, I'm just going to stick out a plug for bicycles. There isn't any technology, including rail, that can do as much as the bicycle can for eliminating emissions. So part of that big package has to include the whole range of things, bicycling and, of course, rail. So there's three areas that I'm going to put forward where rail has a contribution to make. Those areas are freight, inner city travel, long distance travel, right? and regional commuter rail type service, but thinking in terms not just of the trip, but the change in lifestyle and land use that come with that come with the downtown train station. So thinking of freight rail, I imagine that you've seen the ads that say 1 ton of freight can be moved 496 miles by 1 gallon of fuel. The freight advantages that rail has are pretty stark. About 1/3 of the fuel is required to move freight by rail as opposed to truck. It's really significant. And of course, that means 1/3 of the pollution is emitted by rail instead of truck. There are powerful efficiencies moving freight by train, particularly over the longer distances. Where are we going with that? Well, we've got electric trucks potentially in the wings. We'll see how that develops. We potentially have hydrogen trucks. So that is going to change things on the truck side. But on the rail side, we also have hydrogen engines. The first battery engines have been built. And of course, we have the potential of electrification, which is a little more complicated. So we're looking towards a future of net zero freight operations, rail and truck, but we still have the inherent technological advantage of the rail. The basic laws of physics and thermodynamics are not canceled, and those are the efficiency of the steel rail, steel versus rubber, which generates friction, and the efficiency of a whole train instead of individual trucks, and the air resistance from moving through the air with one train versus each individual truck. All those things will mean that there will always be an energy and therefore emissions advantage to railroads, and particularly freight railroads. So freight is easy pickings. Freight represents 24%, or rather trucks represent 24% of the transportation emissions that are out there. 24% is a large section, and we can't ignore it. In contrast to rail, which hauls about the same ton miles, emits 2% of the transportation emissions. So that's pretty stark, right? Much of that truck traffic is short distance. Much of it is not going to be put on a train because it's going to the end markets in the local communities that we have. But an awful lot of it could easily be transferred over. So what's going to make the difference for freight? A lot of that freight comes down to somebody's Excel spreadsheet, and you have to look at the economics of trucking versus the economics of rail freight. And the situation we're in right now is the trucks don't pay their full share of damage. They don't pay hardly anything for the pollution that they spew up into the air. So as long as that disparity exists, there's an imbalance, and that has allowed trucking to expand the way it has. We could change that imbalance through public policy, through tolls or taxation. And carbon taxing, if it happens, would also alter that balance one way or the other. So after freight, the other item that rail should be part of the solution is intercity passenger travel. So there is a goal in the energy plan to increase intercity rail ridership by 400% in Vermont. That's part of the whole package of converting to a more green economy. Just a 10% rise in intercity travel would eliminate 14,000 tons of carbon. And an average Vermonter emits just 10 tons a year. So do the numbers, that's a lot. An average trip to New York City on the train or in the car or on the car uses about as much fuel as 2 weeks of commuting. So obviously we need to work on the local trips, the commuting, but the trips to New York and beyond, they use an outsized amount of emissions. So air travel, we talked about trucking being 24% of emissions. Air travel is 10% of transportation emissions. And much of that travel by air could easily go by rail. New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, DC, those are all places that one could substitute rail relatively easily for air. And doing so would make a big difference. So air and the long distance car trips are part of the package that should be shifted over to rail. So how do we do that? Well, with 400% increase in ridership, it's not going to happen just by adding people to the trains we have now. We need new trains, more trains to attract those new riders. To do that, we would need a return of the overnight Montrealer running up from Washington, DC and New York to Burlington and Montreal. We would need second trains in the Connecticut River Valley. We would need trains to Bennington. Add these things and we create the market and people will come and ride the train. And we will see that shift from carbon intensive driving and flying to Amtrak intercity passenger trains. So freight, intercity. The third thing is community rail. So many of you know about the Bud cars that have arrived in Vermont. And the vision is a Vermont-sized commuter rail network centered on Burlington, Winooski, and Essex Junction that goes to St. Albans and Montpelier, Barre, and Winooski. So you know, of course, that public transit saves on emissions for each trip, but it's a bigger picture than that. It isn't simply each trip. It is the larger lifestyle package that happens when someone changes from a driver every day to a public transit user. The changes involve different living patterns, different land use, and somebody who changes from a single trip by car to a single trip by public transit is going to save about, in average, 10% of their emissions. But somebody who gets rid of their car and moves to being a public transit rider is going to save 30% of their emissions. And the difference there is the changes over a wide variety of area. They are more likely to move closer to downtown train stations. They're more likely to have compact land use, have smaller houses, smaller buildings. They're more likely to live closer to places they can walk to. They're more likely to be healthy. And all those things add up to real changes in the transit lifestyle. A transit lifestyle can happen when someone rides the bus, and that's good. But buses don't have the power to pull people out of their cars in the way that rail does. And why is that? I don't know. I ride buses, but other people don't, and they will ride a train. The studies show that about twice as many people will ride a train than ride a bus. So if you're serious about increasing the people who are transit users day in and day out, rail is the way to do that. So what do we need to advance community rail? Well, one of the hurdles is that half of the tracks in Vermont are owned by the private railroad, the New England Central Railroad. They exist to earn money, of course. And the way to deal with that is for the state to buy the tracks. Doing so would make it much easier to run passenger trains. Along with that, the tracks from Burlington to Essex Junction, just 7 miles, and from Montpelier Junction, Montpelier and Barry, which is also 7 miles, need an upgrade, faster speeds, and new crossing signals. In the world of transportation projects, that isn't much money to upgrade those tracks. The real hurdle is working with the freight railroads, the freight railroad in particular, to buy the track and get the operating rights. So what's our action plan? I have laid out something of a long-term vision here, right? More trains, more intercity trains going to Montreal, additional train service. For freight, the action plan is, over the long term, it's increase the weight capacity in the freight network, increase the competitive access that Vermont has to the national railroad network, and potentially build spurs to high freight flow areas. The Middlebury Spur was one example. The trash going to the dump in Coventry, Vermont could easily be taken off the roads and put on rail. And with some access to other markets, we could bring an awful lot of the milk off the highways onto the rail. So these are long-term visions, but right now, next steps are, first of all, marketing the trains we have. So the carbon footprint of each person who takes the train, who hasn't taken it before, is nothing, right? A transit service that's already running doesn't take extra carbon to accommodate more riders. Till you've reached a certain point, and then you need more buses, more trains to increase the market. But we're in a position right now where the most important thing to do is to market the service we have now, bring it to a wider population base, fill the seats. One of the reasons that cars have such horrible environmental footprint is because most of us are hauling around empty seats all the time. Most trips are with one person. And in the world of transit, that is a danger as well. The nature of having buses sized for rush hour and then empty in the rest of the day doesn't help the economic consequences of transit operations. But if we bring people into that capacity that already exists, we are making a stronger service and doing so for no environmental cost. So marketing is really important. Marketing is not the kind of thing that naturally goes into the way of doing business of government agencies and highway builders and so forth. It's a change of consciousness, but it's important. Number two is making sure we move forward on bringing the Amtrak service up to Montreal. That's really the next step for expanding our intercity network. And it also is a step that has relatively low environmental consequence with a high ridership result. So think of a mall with an anchor store at two ends. Right now we have New York City and the cities down south, and the train goes up through Vermont and people get off at every stop, and by the time it gets up to St. Albans, it's fairly empty. But put Montreal at the other end of the train and now you have a destination at each end. And it's only an hour from St. Albans up to Montreal, maybe less. And so for a fairly cheap price operationally, it's like we've gotten two trains, one going each way. So that's low-hanging fruit for our rail network. And it should be something easy to do because it's not that long of a distance. It's something that is a little complex because we have a border in the way. So time to get moving on Montreal. marketing, Montreal, and the third next step is to look seriously at buying the trackage from Burlington to Essex Junction and maybe beyond to St. Albans and Montpelier, creating the opportunity for our own Vermont community rail network. Doing that is something that would need a little bit more refined of a business plan. Putting that business plan together makes the case for a strategic purchase from the railroad. So we would advocate both the plan and moving forward with negotiations with the railroad for making that Vermont property. The difference that we have now between state-owned highways and the state-owned rail network that Vermont Rail System operates on, and the private network, in terms of what we can accomplish, is interesting. And I will say that New England Central Railroad is cooperative and does support passenger rail in many ways. But they exist ultimately to run freight and create a profit. So that's my action plan there. Montreal, marketing, and paving the way for a commuter rail network with state ownership. I am happy to have more questions. All things rail. I see one about Alburg. The question is, can we have a train station in Alburg? Well, Alburg isn't on a railroad at the moment. It used to be. It used to be on the Rutland Railroad, but there hasn't been a railroad line through Alburg since 1963. So could that change? Yeah, if you threw money at it, but I don't expect that in the immediate future.
Christopher, thanks a lot. This is Steve here. Thanks for that great overview of potential for rail here in Vermont and what the challenges are. We have another question there from Reg Jones about the western side of Vermont. Reg, do you want to say something, or should we just go from what you put in your question? Christopher, can you see that? Yeah.
I just, as I said in my question, I have memories as a youngster of riding the trains from New York City up to North Bennington. My grandfather, we lived in Bennington, where I still live. My grandfather would just ride over to the North Bennington station and we'd be home. And a few years ago, there was a big to-do about lots of excitement. We were going to see that route reinstated. The trains were going to come into Bennington rather than Rutland and go up the western side of the state all the way to Burlington. As of right now, we just have the spur line in through Woodstock into Rutland, and that's the only one on the western side of the state with no north-south line, simply the one going from St. Glenn's Falls over to Rutland. And I'm just haven't heard anything in years now. And I just wonder if that plan is dead, or is there still hope in the future?
I wouldn't say it's dead. I would say the focus has been on the Western corridor, on getting the train that goes to Rutland up to Burlington, which will be accomplished in 2022. And the other focus has been getting the train up to Montreal, which is still being worked on, and I would like to see it happen faster. Get those things out of the way, and then it's time to say what next. And there's a few what next opportunities. One of them being another train in the Connecticut River Valley. But Bennington is certainly on that list of what next. You know, there are trains that go to Albany and spend the night in Albany, and they're just sitting there. It wouldn't take much to take one of those Albany trains and keep going and go up to Bennington. You wouldn't even need new train equipment. So there is a logic to that, eventually I think we'll see play itself out.
It seems to me that one of the issues was the ownership of the tracks in New York State and working out a arrangement where the trains could come from Albany to Bennington and then go north as opposed to going up and then crossing to Rutland.
Yeah, I mean, making the service happen is going to require some work for sure, but it's possible.
Great. We have a question also from Greg Hostetler.
Yeah, do you want me to ask it in person?
Great. Yeah, sure. Go right ahead.
Yeah. So, I'm sure you know that there's a border crossing on the train that goes from Albany to Montreal, and I think it stops. If memory serves me correctly, it stops pretty much right there on the border, like in the middle of a field. And then the border guards get on the train. And I wasn't around back when the train from Burlington continued up to Montreal, but was it the same sort of border crossing? And for the future Montrealer, assuming it comes back, is that also what they're thinking? Is having border guards just hop on the train when you get to the border? Or is there something more complicated than that? I'm just wondering why it's taking so long to reconnect that train to Montreal.
The problem with the border crossing on the Adirondack, and this was a problem on the old Montrealer, is the train would show up and then it was at the mercy of the border agents. And you never knew how long that process was going to take. And the problem for passengers down the line is it was very hard to keep that train on time. And so the Adirondack over in New York State is notoriously late on its way south past the border. And, that's not what you want in a well-run train operation, is trains that you can never count on for being on time. So the real solution would be for the border folks to do their work while the train was in motion. But that seems to be impossible for them to conceive. I think their idea is that they need more security and that they can't imagine guns in that kind of environment and so on and so on. And it just seems that that's not going to happen in our world. So the solution that has been devised is to build a border crossing facility in Montreal Central Station. So what would happen with the train would be what is happening now with air travel to and from Montreal, where US border folks are in Montreal, along with the Canadian border folks. And when you arrive to Canada in Montreal Central Station, you go through customs. And when you go home, you go through US customs at Montreal Central Station. And then the train just runs nonstop to St. Albans, or on the other side, it would be to Rouse's Point. So that'll save a lot of time for the train. That border crossing process was taking an hour, hour and a half on the good days. So it'll be better for everybody. And more importantly than that, it'll be much more reliable. The train will be able to leave when it says it will, and you won't have that uncertainty for the people who aren't even going across the border.
No, that makes sense. That is a better plan. I've taken the Greyhound up to Montreal, and it runs into the same problems. It's notoriously late.
Yeah, and you're right. Of course, that does introduce a complexity, because there has to be that facility built in Montreal Station, and the customs people have to agree to it, and then it has to be funded. We aren't talking large money here, but it's multiple agencies from two countries, and the hardest thing has already happened, and that was an international treaty.
So is there a plan and sort of a date when they expect that to happen, or have we not even gotten to the part where there's a plan?
Every time I ask that question, Brian Searles tells me 3 years, and I've been asking for a lot of years.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we've got a couple, I see a couple of hands. I think we'll go back and forth between the hands raised and the chat, but keep the questions coming. We'll go to Matthew LaFleur. Matthew.
Yes, I have a question. Yeah, I live in Grand Isle County where, we border Canada and New York. We're actually gateways. Is there any opportunity because we get freight that comes down from Canada that goes through Auburn, my town, and we get a lot of freight traffic there. So, I mean, is there any opportunity that neighboring, towns of Vermont, like my town and Highgate and Swanton, which neighboring corridors to Canada, is there any opportunity for them to, partake, how to get the rail basically from point A to point B from Canada to those, stations, so it would help St. Albans out too as well? Is there any opportunity not only to advance that, like the Montrealer, but to bring, job economics to those towns that really need it?
There was a train
Thank you.
service that operated around 1980 that was overnight intermodal freight service from, it changed around at different points, but Montreal or St. Albans down to southern New England and Connecticut and towards Boston. I think there's scope for that service to resume, but doing so, there's several hurdles in the way. So it's not going to happen unless the nature of the freight network changes, and potentially if the economic balance between freight and trucking changes as well. So tomorrow, that's not going to happen, but I think there's a logic to it at some point. There's also about, I think it's about 40 trucks a day that move from intermodal terminals in Montreal to the Burlington area. Using the conventional double stacked technology, it's not economic to build a container terminal in Burlington for that little traffic, but there are some intriguing technological possibilities that one could imagine could capture that traffic from Montreal to Burlington. Again, that's not going to be tomorrow. That's not low-hanging fruit.
Thank you for answering my questions.
Great, thank you, Matthew. We'll go over to our chat, and I see Anne has a question about hearing the trains run up the western side of the state again. Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. So I'm a European, I'm from Britain, and I grew up with the public system in Europe. It's great, and I just love it when I go back and use those trains. I used to go to school on the train, and if you couldn't get a train, you get a bus. And there'd be a whole public system, transit system linked in with the trains and the buses. So you didn't need to take a car anywhere if you didn't have to. I think that's what we should aim for, but obviously that would take a lot to do. I actually live near the freight train tracks in Manchester, and I hear the train whistle. I love it. Of course, you probably would hear it more often if it was a freight train, if it was a passenger train. But I think it's great, and there'd be a lot of people wanting to use the train here because of the ski resorts. It would be a good tourist attraction. We've got wonderful views from the train. People would love it. It would be kind of like going through Scotland or Switzerland with the gorgeous terrain that we have here. I think that would be a huge marketing point. The other point that I did have, though, as a downer is that I noticed the rails are very low here near water systems, and with climate change and all, that there may be a problem with flooding down here. So I think, if we were going to use those rails, we would have to build them higher up. So that might be an issue to think about for the future anywhere. Also, have you seen or heard about the bus train cars that switch from tires to train wheels to be able to travel on roads and rails? So you can switch them very easily from road to rail and vice versa. I think that's a great idea.
So a lot there. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah.
My dad's British, and so I've spent a fair amount of time roaming around the railroad network of Britain and going to and from London. The buses that convert to rail wouldn't be allowed under the regulations in the United States because there are particular expectations of crash strength for US trains. In the United States, there are many more railroad crossings, grade crossings, level crossings than in England. And so you can imagine what would happen if one of those buses hit a train. It wouldn't be pretty. So that's, from a regulatory perspective, that couldn't happen in the United States. There's also some disadvantage in the bus spending extra fuel for carrying around railroad wheels, which are heavy. Plus, it's relatively easy to make people get off the bus and get on the train.
Interesting. Well, I see Greg has his hand up. Greg Epler-Wood. Welcome, Greg.
Okay, unmuted, I guess. Yep.
Hello, Greg.
Hi, first, how are you? Just a quick comment. I guess it's no longer true, but you know, we had a place in Albert, and I always noticed the rails were relatively, used relatively frequently from Swan across the Swing Bridge through Albert. Maybe that stopped it. I thought I heard you say that there's no longer train service through Albert. But anyway, my other question, my main question here is I'd like to hear a little bit more about what would be the game plan, what would be the process, the steps that would be required for the state to purchase that rail that you were talking about.
So a state purchase would require a deal, right? So there would be negotiating back and forth, a price named, a price counter offers, and all of that sort of thing. The state isn't going to get into that without, I think, more of a solid business plan. And neither, I think, is the railroad going to do that without some sense that their interest in the freight service is preserved. So the short answer is money. But it's not just money. There's a negotiating relationship that would happen. And those things don't just, they're not instant events. It does occur to me to mention, I said Alberg has no train service because I was thinking of the old Rutland Railroad. But the East Alberg is not Alberg, but maybe you would consider it Alberg. That's on the Central Vermont Railroad. It's a pretty small little spot. I can't imagine the train stopping there. But there is train service there.
And so the question about the purchase of the rails is that would be long term, and it would also, I assume, a lot of advocacy by us, for example.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. We go to Suzanne.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Sorry, as you know, I was driving before. So if you already mentioned this, I do apologize. But in your perfect world, to have everything that you want to have happen, how much would it cost approximately? What are the past, what are the current funding possibilities now? What are future possibilities? How much of it would be federal, state, local, all of that stuff to get everything connected and up and going?
The infrastructure spending would primarily be federal. We do spend money on the state level, and there would be a match for federal funding. But there are federal infrastructure programs that we have and could continue to draw from. The state also pays Amtrak to operate train service as it is. And what I would like to see is that amount increased somewhat, but ridership increased more, right? So that the amount of new revenue from new riders goes up at a larger rate than the state's payment for service. So that, in other words, the per rider contribution from the state goes down. Following me? Making the service more efficient, I think, is a win. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. So what would that cost? I don't want to put a number out there because that's another negotiating relationship. Put a number out there, and then the cost will be not only that, but more so because Amtrak, our partner in operating the train service and negotiating for its payment, right?
If I may, what is this monetarily feasible with what is in place now?
Yes. So, order of magnitude, right now we're paying $8 million a year for Amtrak service. I imagine, this is not a number from Amtrak, but I imagine 15 million-ish for service that's, let's say, 4 times more service. So the more service you get, it should not be an equal relationship with the payments. Excuse me.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, well, let's see. I see Donna's next, and feel free to either put questions in the chat or raise your hand. So we'll go to Donna, and then Sue's next. Go ahead, Donna. Maybe it's less of a question and more of a comment. Is Donna still with us? Not sure Donna is still with us. Oh,
I
she
do see
is.
her comment in the chat.
Yeah.
She said she lived in. She lived in. Sorry, my chat's zipping back and forth and making it hard for me to read.
Hi,
There she
sorry.
is.
Yeah, I was just commenting that I lived in Montreal for 15 years and really enjoyed being able to take the train to Toronto, Ottawa, further west. I actually don't think I ever took it down into Vermont at that time, but just it's such a wonderful way to travel for business and pleasure, and I can't wait to have that opportunity here. We live in Burlington and are excited to see that the train will be here soon. Fingers crossed. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Donna. We have a hand up from the gentleman with the phone number. Maybe you could
Hello,
introduce
Bill.
yourself and you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
How's
There you
that?
go. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, Chris.
Hi.
I got my email this morning about the new schedule of the Ethan Allen.
Right.
So I won't belabor that. You know what my thoughts are, and you can share them with the rest of the people if you think it's appropriate. With on the subject of efficiency, is it absolutely impossible for Vermont rail crews to operate the Amtrak train on Vermont rail property? Is that a non-negotiable item?
I would not say it's impossible. I would say that's very much negotiable. There are Amtrak would not like to see that happen, and they control access into Penn Station and Albany. So there are difficulties with that.
How about if it was just between Rutland and Vermont? So you wouldn't have to make this change in the Ethan Allen schedule to ensure that the crew has proper rest in Burlington. I mean,
that is something that
Amtrak is running this train for its own convenience rather
That's right.
than from a marketing perspective, rather than from the perspective of what schedule is going to maximize ridership. Getting to New York at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening is not going to do much. And then on Sundays, when you would like to have a later arrival in New York, it's getting in there too soon. It's cutting down on the amount of time people have to spend, say, for a weekend in Vermont when it leaves Rutland at 12:30 instead of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. My stepdaughter uses the train frequently between Rutland and New York, and she found the 8:15 departure from Rutland pretty convenient. She'd still have half a day in New York for work. Now it's impossible. I'm going to have to let her drive my car to Albany, or else I said to you in the email, drive to New Haven and take Metro North. It's just not going to work. I see them doing this for their own convenience rather than to serve the public, and that troubles me. And now, what about the change? What about the change in New York? Are they going to combine the Vermonter with the train to Albany? Is that the reason why they're not continuing to get on beyond New York to Washington?
So Bill is referring to the schedule change on the Amtrak Ethan Allen. He, and I agree with him, he thinks the new schedule is problematic, and we'll find out. We'll see what that does to ridership. And so you propose that the Vermont rail system operation could be a solution, and well, it could. And I do know that those conversations have happened, and the state has thought at some level about that. You know, there's a gap between a conversation and making it actually happen. And that Amtrak does retain advantages, like I said, and a one-seat ride to New York does count for something. And when you make people change trains, you do reduce ridership. So all those things are part of the mix. And I think that it would be to our advantage to keep exploring ideas like that. If Amtrak has competition out there, then that just helps Vermont's position in these negotiations.
How do you feel about broaching the idea that a Vermont railway crew run the train between Rutland and Burlington? For example, if a Vermont crew did handle it, they would go on duty in Burlington, say in the morning around 6 o'clock or 7, run the train to Rutland, let the Amtrak crew take the train out of Rutland at approximately the same time as it's leaving now, between 8 and 8:30. And then that Vermont crew could go back to Burlington with their usual Rutland to Burlington freight train. And then in the evening, another Vermont crew could come on. They could take the Burlington to Rutland freight train south and then go back on the Amtrak train. They'd have to change clothes perhaps, but it's a non-union operation. And I know when I worked for the railway, there was a Chinese wall between passenger service and freight service. They called them two different classes of service, and you could not combine the two. But the Vermont Railway is not unionized, and I don't see that that's an impenetrable barrier. This would allow the Vermont Railway to use their crews efficiently, would probably save Amtrak, or would save the state money in terms of subsidizing the service. It would be more efficient, and we'd have a more attractive schedule. We could have an early morning southbound train arrive in New York around 1 o'clock or so, and then it could come back a little later in the afternoon, the way it does on Fridays now, around 5 o'clock or so. Well, maybe they wouldn't have to leave that late. Maybe you could leave on there is a 4:40 train from New York to Albany, which could be extended north. And that would give people the better part of the day in New York. And I just think it would be a far more attractive service than leaving at 2:20 in the afternoon. this business about running these trains at their own convenience is really very disturbing.
Well, I agree with you about the timing, and at this point, it's a done deal, but we're going to see the results. And you know, we're going to be weighing in on that conversation. And you propose one solution, which is Vermont Rail system operating the train, and I know that they would be open to that because I've heard them say so. And another solution could be an Amtrak crew base in Burlington.
Oh, that's not very practical, though. I don't think
it might not be.
practical.
But you're absolutely right.
I wouldn't suggest that. That would be very difficult to do and probably expensive. You'd have to start dedicating crews from Albany all the way to Burlington when someone was sick and they had to lay off, or when someone's on vacation. That would really make things complicated. But if Vermont Railway could just run the train between Burlington and Vermont and combine it with their once-a-day freight train, it would be a very efficient operation. Everybody would be effectively utilized.
You're right.
All right. Well, thanks for your thoughts on that. I think I'm going to pass it off to Rob. Did you have a question?
No, it was just a follow-up on the Ethan Allen time change. I saw earlier today that there's some people concerned with the time change schedule, that they wouldn't be able to meet connections in, like, say, Albany or even in New York Penn Station to other trains. So that's the only thing it wasn't exactly a question, but your thoughts, Christopher.
Okay.
So my biggest concern is that the people coming from New York and that area to Vermont are going to find the times, like Bill said, not to be conductive to what they want to do. I'm particularly concerned with the skiers that use the train to come up to Rutland and Killington, you know, up on Friday and then back on Sunday afternoon. But certainly, like Bill said, that morning time. And I got enough advance warning that I thought about making a case to VTrans about these times. And I did not find any real data to back up what is basically an educated opinion that Bill and I share. So now we're going to get data for better or worse. The issue of connecting trains is, yes, that's an issue because there are people who would like to go from Vermont to Florida or Vermont to Chicago, and the new schedule is worse or even impossible for those connections. I don't think that's as big of an issue because I just don't think there are as many people going from Vermont to Florida as Vermont to New York City. But you know, we're about to get data, so we'll see what happens next.
Thanks.
We're getting close to the end here. I don't see other questions, Christopher, but I wonder if you have thoughts on your next steps, your marketing and Amtrak to Montreal and community network, community rail. Do you see opportunities for those coming up in this upcoming legislative session? Do you see short-term opportunities there? What's next for us?
So we do see opportunities, and we're working on each of these. So, for example, we have a committee that we pulled together of folks that are really invested in the marketing. And we've been working with VTrans directly. And we're pulling together a more serious plan that we would like to advance to suggest specifics. The very first thing we did is to produce train schedules because Amtrak, in their wisdom, no longer actually produces the traditional grid with all of the times of the trains. So if you go to, and I'll drop this in the chat, railvermont.org/EthanAllenSchedule.pdf. And I'm just copying this down so I can paste it in the chat for you. There's a similar one for the Vermonter. sorry, here I'm giving my attention to just making sure I get the link right. So that's our first offering, is just the basic train schedule, and we're going to think about where to distribute that. As you can see, it's already up on the website. We're thinking about the governing structure of marketing. Maybe Vermont should be actually looking towards hiring its own staff to do marketing work and to support station agents. And in terms of Montreal, you know, it just seems like it's slow, and it seems like the role of advocacy organizations is to build support in a way that gives these slow processes a kick. You know, when it becomes more of a priority for people and when there's more attention on it, then things seem to move. So in January, on January 4th at noon, the Vermont Rail Action Network is going to have a Zoom meeting focused on marketing. And we're going to learn from the marketing director of the Downeaster train service in Maine, and other folks that I'm still working on the subject of marketing for train service. And then following that, on a date to be determined, we're going to do a Zoom conference about getting back to Montreal. And we're going to learn from Brian Searles, who's doing the good work for Vermont on that project. We're going to learn what needs to happen from his perspective, and how we can help as citizens and leaders. And then as far as community rail, that's a tough one, and we have not given up, but there have been some setbacks. We need to find funding to create a business plan that puts us in a more solid position. So that probably means federal grant funding. We need to take that and build legislative support, and we're not talking this session, legislative support for purchase of trackage. I see some hands up, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time. Maybe we could, Bill had his hand up for a bit there. Bill?
Yes, on the subject of going back to Vermont,
I should say, if you could do a brief question.
Yeah,
we don't have much time left.
Here it is. Amtrak already runs a train from Washington to Springfield, Mass. A through train, no change in New Haven. It gets to Springfield sometime around midnight. That would be an easy extension right to Montreal. And we would have what we had previously. We would have early morning departures from, say, White River Junction North, arriving in Montreal by, say, 9 o'clock. And then in the reverse direction, leaving as the Montreal used to, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the evening, serving Northern Vermont at reasonable hours and getting to White River by midnight or so, which would make a one-day round trip to Montreal possible. Or if people want to stay the weekend, it would only require one night at a hotel. We just extend the Vermonter to Montreal now and get there at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, that's a recipe for just a flagrant failure, as far as I can see. Especially having to leave there at 5 or 6 in the morning.
I think each schedule serves different markets. A train leaving Montreal in the morning brings Canadians down towards Vermont and further south, and an overnight train brings Vermonters up to Montreal. So both of them have their place, is what I think.
So which is the bigger
let's go to Renee. Thanks, Bill. Let's go to Renee for a last question here.
Hi, this is Thomas. I'm sitting in with Renee. And I'd like to go back to the comment on connections. I used to take Amtrak a lot, but I haven't I live in Montpelier, less than 3 miles from the Amtrak station. And I can't take the train anymore because I can't make connections. And so to me, the ability to make connections at Springfield or New York to points west and at New York to points south is extremely important to me. And that ties in with the timetables as well, is having basically a complete national timetable so I can figure out where I can go. It's not that I want to go here. It's like, well, where can I go that I want to go see? And so I appreciate your focus on trying to get timetables back. And I don't think you should discount connections because you think so few people use them. For those of us who rely on the connections, they are important. And we haven't had them for a long, long time, 10, 15, 20 years. Not 20, 15 maybe.
Thanks, Renee.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to discount connections. And I will say that, you know, if you add up the total places you can get on each of the trains and the total places you can get by connections, there's vastly more trip possibilities by connections. So you always want those extra riders. And lastly, the Rail Passengers Association has a web page which has all of the timetables for America. And I am quickly looking it up to see if I can drop it in the chat, but I don't know if I can find it that fast. But
while you do that,
find it.
While you do that, Christopher, let me just thank you for joining us tonight. And it's been a great discussion. Thanks for everybody's input. I want to note that Rob Kidd has dropped into the chat a link to a town hall that's being hosted right now by the Vermont Legislature's Climate Solutions Caucus. And so I encourage everybody to drop in on that too. And thanks so much. Rob, do you have any closing words?
Yes. So thank you very much, Christopher, and everybody else for participating in this conversation. The Sierra Club, we were working on transportation issues, so we're trying to do a lot of things. And I just wanted to say, I was really excited over the summer when the Amtrak relaunched in Vermont and they had all these events at the different stations. I see some of those things people need to be brought attention to the usage of trains to elevate their availability. So I would love to partner with the Rail Action Network and possibly promoting something like that in the future. We did an event with David Blerlestorff and All Earth Rail on one of the Bud cars a couple of years ago, and now people were so excited about that. So I think we just got to bring out the buzz for that. So anyway, this conversation's ending, but I just wanted to put a whole flag on people's radar. Is we're doing a planning meeting on January 6th about kind of an EV pop-up and singing flash mob. So this is going to be a little bit different, but this is kind of the ideas that I want to propose to people. Is we got to be thinking outside the box of how to promote ideas, and so we're going to be planning this. But like I said, I would love to work with some of you on maybe some rail promotion. So otherwise, thank you all for joining us. But if you're able to go follow that link to the Climate Caucus, thanks for the flexibility in changing this meeting conversation, Christopher, and thanks for all who joined at the new time. So, and that's going to be the end of this discussion, but hopefully for a lot more discussions.
Thanks so much.